right, so I appreciate your patience. I'll try to be brief and just make a couple of points here. So what I would like to do is really focus on three larger points, mostly not about Congress, by the way. There will be no reference to Congress in my comments. But I am going to talk about public opinion, essentially how we got to this point. What everyone thinks about the current administration, certainly its first 20 some odd days or whatever the number is, have been consequential and from some perspectives even disruptive. And it does beg the question, why? How did we get here? Are Americans really supportive of these policies? I'm going to hit on 3 points here to help us understand how we got here. How a candidate, what everyone thinks about that candidate is unusual in a variety of different ways. He's the oldest candidate ever elected president. He's the only twice impeached president who subsequently got reelected as president. He is a convicted felon. All those things are undeniably true. It is also true that he won more votes than his opponent in the last election. So how did that happen? I think I want to draw your attention to three things that you may not know already. The first of them, in the vein of public opinion, has to do with what Americans know about politics. And oftentimes, political journalists, political observers, politicians themselves underestimate, or I should say overestimate, the level of political knowledge in the mass public. That is to say, you may be thinking, how could the winning candidate in this last election or in any other previous election, depending on your politics, how could they win? Don't most Americans know where they're coming from? Don't they recognize the positions and how terrible they may be, depending, again, on your point of view and which election we're talking about? But the thing I want to drive home in my brief comments here this evening is that Americans are woefully uninformed about politics. They are mostly devoid of ideological content in terms of their perspectives. You might think that that is overstated. You might think that that's hyperbole. If anything, it's understated. In fact, we know from a variety of studies, some of which originating here at the University of Michigan over the last several decades, that roughly only about 20% of voters are familiar with ideological terms, liberal and conservative, that we use so readily in our discussion about politics. It's rare for them to employ ideological terms when they characterize the political parties, the candidates. Indeed, a significant minority of Americans, maybe even a majority depending on how you count, don't know which party is the more conservative party. You might think that that's hyperbole. I assure you it is not. The point I'm making with the comments I'm providing to you this evening is not that we, those of us in this room, are all enlightened and brilliant. That may be true. But the point is that Americans don't typically attend to politics. And because they don't typically attend to it, not like the kinds of people, most of whom are in this room, they don't have coherent political views. Their views are frequently their policy views. We know. This is not speculation. This is not my opinion. Their policy views are unstable. They are wildly unstable. They vary over time. They do not cohere in any ideological fashion that we could justifiably call ideological. They are, in short, innocent, typically, of ideology. All right, so if you at least accept for the purposes of my comments this evening that that's the case, then it does beg the question, if Americans are not thinking about politics in terms of ideology, and I assure you for most Americans they are not doing that, then how are they thinking about politics? We, as a community of scholars in political science and related disciplines, do know the answer to that question as well. For the most part, when people think about politics, the perspective they employ is one that focuses on salient social groups in society. And perhaps the most salient social group, certainly the most persistent and consistent in terms of its political impact, has been racial groups, in particular attitudes about Black Americans. It is, after all, the issue around which we had the bloodiest war in American history, the Civil War. It's the issue, the group around which we had the largest social movement in the 20th century, the Civil Rights Movement. It's also the issue around which we had the largest social movement in the 21st century, Black Lives Matter. So I am not here saying that that is the only thing. I realize we haven't introduced race into any of the conversations we've been having. But if we want to get a sense about how we arrived at this point we're at now in our political collective lives, we can't ignore race. Race is fundamental to the American party system. And by that I mean to the division of party conflict, or the structure of party conflict in America. We have one party in light of events in the 1960s that emerged as the party that was mostly the champion of civil rights, sometimes reluctantly, and then the other party, for which the people who were not happy with the first party went into the second party. That was true in 1964. And it's true in 2024 and 2025. I like to tell my undergraduate classes when I talk about these matters in far more elaborate form than I'm doing in my 5 or 10-minute chunk this evening, that the last time that white Americans in the national context voted for a Democratic presidential candidate was 1964. And in every single presidential contest since that time, a majority of whites have voted for the Republican candidate. Sometimes that candidate wins, sometimes that candidate loses. I draw your attention to that only to drive home the point I've been trying to make in my brief comments, that the racial divide is the biggest divide in American politics. And I want to be more even clear than that. When I say the racial divide, I mean the black-white divide. The black-white divide is bigger than the gender gap, a lot bigger. It's bigger than the class/education gap. It's a lot bigger. It is the foundation of the current party system in our country. That is not irrelevant to our current political moment. We can dance around that. We can try to ignore it. We can talk about other matters, but that is undeniable. That doesn't mean, by the way, that one necessarily adopts a moral stance against people in the other party. I'm actually not here to make a moral claim, but I am here to make a factual claim. And the factual claim is that race is the chief dividing point in American politics. And why is that relevant for our discussion this evening about what's going on with the current administration? Well, if voters are not thinking about politics in terms of ideology and policies, by the way, another kind of key fact here that I like to give to my own undergraduates in my class, on most of the salient issues of the day, most Americans agree. Permissive gun laws, they don't like them. Anti-abortion efforts, most Americans don't like that either. Tax cuts for the rich, they don't think that's a great idea either, in either party. But they can agree, or maybe more accurately, partisanship can be structured around those things which they are fundamentally in disagreement about, and that's salient social groups. Not just race, obviously, with respect to religion, Muslims, Jews, various other groups, also with respect to sexuality, homosexuality, gays, lesbian, trans. That's a salient dividing point between the parties. And if you accept for the moment that thing that I just said as being true, and whether you accept it or not, it is true, it provides an irresistible incentive for politicians to play on that in order to generate a winning coalition. Maybe that sounds familiar to some of you. Politicians sometimes play to those grievances They play to those fears, they play to those stereotypes in order to generate a winning coalition. And the reason that they do it is because it works. And when I say they, I don't just mean the big bad Republicans, because the Democrats do it too. They do it in a slightly different way, and they're less effective in doing it, in part for historical reasons. But, you know, from Carter to Clinton to Obama, Obama, by the way, who deported more immigrants than any president before or since, Democratic politicians are trying to demonstrate that they're not the party of racial minorities. And so please vote for us. Republicans, on the other hand, broadly speaking, at least since the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon, or before that with George Wallace and Barry Goldwater in 1964, the Republicans are trying to paint the Democrats as the party of minorities and other unpopular groups. And they do that because it works. So I mention all of these things in my, hopefully I'm still under time here. I'll conclude. I do this only to make the following point. If we really want to solve and answer to the question, what can we do? How can we address these problems? We have to confront that thing that I just said. Because whatever one does successfully or unsuccessfully to combat whatever it is they do or do not like about this administration, some other candidacy and administration will come along and they will employ a similar strategy. A strategy that's at least as old as Barry Goldwater from 1964, George Wallace from 1964, 68, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Jimmy Carter. Oh yes, the sainted Jimmy Carter. He did it too. They're going to keep doing it as long as you keep responding to it. I'll end on that note. Thank you.